researcher at Tuta. Brandon, thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here. Looking forward to our talk.
Definitely. Okay, so we are on the topic of email and encryption, and I think maybe the best place to start, even for me, because I'll be honest, like a lot of this is over my head. In the easiest terms that you can, how would you explain regular email encryption? Like if you're using Gmail or Yahoo or anything else, like what is the standard email encryption, and how does that work when you're sending and receiving emails?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so for most big tech providers, like you mentioned, if you're going ahead with Gmail, Yahoo, or Outlook, the standard go-to encryption that they're going to use is TLS, which isn't end-to-end encryption. So TLS basically is going to go ahead and encrypt your connection, but once the data is received to the receiving mail server, it's not encrypted. So it doesn't receive the same degree of protection that your data would have if you were using end-to-end encryption.
Yeah. So in other words, what you're saying is as you send that email and as it's in transit, it is encrypted, but once it lands in their Gmail inbox or their Yahoo inbox or wherever they're hosting their email, then it's available for Google or Yahoo or any of those companies to actually read the contents of that email. Is that correct?
Right. When it's over the wire, you have that guarantee of encryption. You have that encrypted tunnel, but there is no guarantee of secure encryption once it's at rest again at the receiving server. That is fully dependent on where those emails are being hosted.
Okay. Yeah. So it matters both the starting point of the email and the end point of that email and how it's being hosted, correct?
Correct. Right. So if you're sending Gmail to Gmail, you're not going to have that end-to-end encryption guarantee. But say you sent an email from Gmail to Tuta, for example, that email will have TLS encryption over the wire. But then once it lands in that encrypted Tuta account, that data will be encrypted at rest, in addition to being over the wire. So there is some additional security there.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So when we're talking about the difference between just traditional TLS and then upgrading to something like end-to-end encryption, how exactly does that work for, let's say, a service like Tuta?
Yeah, so basically what end-to-end encryption does is where TLS encrypts the connection, end-to-end encryption first encrypts the actual data, the content of that email on your client before it is even sent out. So first, say you go through, you draft your email. When you hit send, it is first encrypted on your device. It's encrypted over the wire. And then depending on where you're sending it to, it remains encrypted. So you have that, you have that end guarantee that the data is also protected, not just while it's over the internet.
Yeah, and that's a question that I get a lot from people that are using, an encrypted service like Tuta or even Proton or others, is does that encryption maintain, keep itself encrypted if I'm sending an email to somebody who is using a Gmail address? How exactly does that work?
Yeah, that depends, and different companies do this in different ways. Some companies go ahead and they'll use PGP as a way of sending encrypted content. Others, like Tuta, we're not currently supporting PGP, but if you send an encrypted email to a Gmail user, that first the email will be encrypted on your client, sent with encryption to Gmail's server, and then they will receive a link to decrypt that email in an encrypted mailbox that we are actually hosting.
Okay.
And that is done via a shared password. That will give them access to the decryption keys.
And just so that I'm clear and everybody else that's watching this is clear, when you say the client, you mean that could be either the app, if you're using the Tuta app or if you're using whatever, is that what you mean when you say client?
Correct. Yeah. So in that case, there's a whole bunch of different ways or types of email clients you could use. So you might have it on your phone. So if you're using the Tuta app, the Proton app, that is an email client. Maybe you have Thunderbird on your desktop. That's also an email client. You also have webmail clients. So if you're going to go through a web browser, it's also encrypted that way.
I feel like I'm just throwing so many different questions at you, but they keep, because these are the questions that I get all the time. So when you're using, let's say, a third-party app like Thunderbird versus logging in with the web app or the dedicated app that you guys provide for Tuta, are there security advantages either way, or is it about the same no matter what you're using?
It really depends. So for example, you can't use Tuta in Thunderbird in third-party clients. It's not currently
Okay.
supported.
Okay.
But we offer our own client for all operating systems. So Windows, Mac, Linux, phones, whichever way you want to use it. One thing that is nice about that is first, everything is going to play together nicely. It's one environment. So you don't need to worry about the compatibility problems popping up. And one thing that is also I think is a security advantage to going ahead and using a dedicated mail client from, like, for example, from Tuta, if you're using a Tuta account using ours, is you do have the security requirements are dependent on what Tuta is doing. If you have a Gmail account and you're running that through Thunderbird, well, now you're trusting Gmail, you're trusting Google, so that's one point. And then you're also trusting Thunderbird. So you're kind of opening out, you're widening your threat model.
Yeah.
So then you need to be worried about two different services if there's any kind of incident, as opposed to, you have that smaller threat model. Yeah.
So would it be fair to say that if you have the opportunity to use the dedicated app for whatever service, whether it's Tuta on my OS or on my app or something like that, that would probably be the better option than going through any kind of third-party provider?
In general, yes. I'm sure for certain platforms, there are probably exceptions. So I can't give
Sure.
a 100% every time use the dedicated client, but usually when services go ahead and do develop their own specific client, like in the case of Tuta, it's done with security in mind. There's a reason behind that. And so it also, sorry.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. Like that's kind of the approach that I've taken personally when people are asking me.
Right.
Anytime you introduce a new piece of software or a new connection, like you said, you are widening your threat profile, and so that makes sense to me. Even if it is a great piece of software, and even if you're setting it up perfectly, there's always that risk there. I want to go back again to what you were saying earlier. So when I'm sending an email from Tuta to another email provider like Gmail, now automatically is it sent as that encrypted, where they have to click over to basically view it on your servers? Is that correct?
That depends based upon your account settings.
Okay.
By default, when you create a new Tuta account, your emails to non-Tuta addresses will be sent automatically using end-to-end encryption. In the settings menu, you can turn that off, so it would automatically be sent like a standard email using TLS. But by default, it uses end-to-end encryption. So you do need to share that password with the recipient in order for them to decrypt the content of your message.
Yeah. And assuming that the recipient isn't using the same service, like a Tuta user emailing a Tuta user, or ProtonMail emailing a ProtonMail user, is it safe to assume that there's no way for me to send an email that resides with that recipient's email provider and still have it end-to-end encrypted without having that link that goes out to another service? Does that make sense? Or another server that you view it from?
One way that people do that is a little bit technical. Going through, some people will use PGP as a way to try and guarantee that encryption. PGP does encrypt email content, but it does have some security features that might be missing that other built-in encryption protocols might have. But currently, if you're going through with any of the big encrypted email providers, that is the major hurdle, is that ability to communicate outside of your ecosystem. And that's one thing you will see a lot of privacy experts when they go through and they're recommending services, be it Tuta, Proton, or any of the other ones, is there is a certain higher degree of security that you have by communicating with other users of that same service, because then the content never needs to go off the wire. It's only moving within.
You're just staying, right within that walled garden. Yeah,
correct. Yeah, and that's a hurdle for email in general. Yeah.
I want you to dive in a little bit further. I recognize the fact that Tuta does not currently use PGP. and you're using your own encryption standard. One, if you can maybe explain a little bit about PGP and the advantages, as well as maybe why Tuta decided to go their own direction when it comes to that kind of encryption.
Yeah, absolutely. So PGP, or Pretty Good Privacy, it's for people who may not know, it's a encryption program that you can use for signing, encrypting, and decrypting data. And it was developed quite a while ago by Phil Zimmerman in 1991. So the original PGP is
Seriously,
older. Yeah,
that is old.
Amazingly interesting story. After he released it, it started to spread over the internet, and people outside of the United States were going ahead and using it. And then there was actually a criminal court case brought against Zimmerman because the government was claiming that this could be equated to munitions exports. So there's a very famous court case against him for the public release of PGP. It's really interesting. And I think it was a lot of smoke and shouting, but I think ultimately he came out of it clean. And I believe I would need to check this, but I believe there was also a way that they went ahead and released it, because there were some restrictions on it in this case, that they printed the actual code for PGP as a book, as a way of saying, okay, this is literature, you can't censor this, as a way of putting it out there. We would need to check that. Like that could be an editing point, possibly.
It still holds up in terms of as a security standard.
And that's kind of a point of debate. It's been there have been upgrades to it. There were some bugs or security flaws early on, but these are things that have been patched. PGP has also developed and kind of changed hands a little bit. I believe the current main developer or push behind PGP is OpenPGP.
Okay.
And so I guess to kind of visualize how PGP works, or what the system is you can kind of think about delivering a message to someone in like a secure lockbox, like those boxes you would have at the bank, security lockboxes. Yeah. So PGP is dependent on two keys, a public and a private key. And if we're using this kind of lockbox metaphor, that lock is going to be a public key. So if I want to send you a message with PGP, I'm going to go ahead, write my message down, put it in my box, and then I will take that public key, encrypt the email, send it to you. So I would give you the box, and then ideally you will have the private key, which in this case is going to be hopefully the only key for that padlock, and you can then decrypt it and read the email, the contents of the encrypted email. But what is very, very important with this is key handling, and that you have a unique key. And there's also some issues with authenticating. Okay, is this the correct? Am I using the correct public key? So if someone goes through and is pretending to be someone else, these are all problems that did face PGP. But these are things they have worked to mitigate. Yeah. The biggest setbacks for PGP that like Tuta is focused on trying to push back against or provide an alternative to are forward secrecy and the overexposure of email metadata. So this is forward secrecy is the ability that if someone were to get older keys that you had used for different communications, if they get those older keys, that they have the ability to decrypt future messages. So perfect forward secrecy is going to go ahead and use an encryption protocol that is constantly changing those keys. So should an earlier key become compromised, it doesn't mean all future conversations are also compromised. This is something that some encryption protocols have put into place. This is something that we are working on with the standard Tuta encryption, and now this is something we're working towards with our post-quantum encryption. And but the biggest, probably most well-known service that is already providing this would be Signal. Okay. Signal's new. I got to think of the acronym here. PQXDH. So post-quantum extended Diffie-Hellman offers this.
Okay. And is that standard if I'm using Signal now? It's like it's been.
That is the default standard encryption for Signal now. Okay. Which really puts it above and beyond as a solid choice for an encrypted email or messaging messaging app.
Interesting. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like that makes it a lot easier because when you're dealing with something like Signal, you're
Mhm.
almost always working within their walled garden because I'm only connecting with people who
Mhm.
are using Signal. So they have a lot of
Yeah.
control there. Whereas with
Mhm.
email, you're working with a lot of different systems
Mhm.
and companies. And is that really what makes all of this a lot more complicated?
To a certain degree, and there are some messaging apps that do allow this kind of bridge functionality where you can go
Okay.
ahead and if you're writing from Signal that you could connect to WhatsApp or any of these different other platforms, but not
Yeah.
every platform offers that. And that interoperability is it's difficult. That's for any jump outside of that where you don't have like complete control. There are additional steps that you need to take to ensure that data is properly protected.
Yeah. Well, I want to jump into this
Mhm.
post quantum stuff that you were talking about because I know that
Yeah.
that's something that Tuta has really done. But before I do that,
Mhm.
I want to kind of go back to something that you said that again, I'm trying to fully understand it myself. When
Mhm.
we're dealing, let's say, with PGP and the public-private key, does that
Mhm.
mean in order for me to send an email to you, I have to know your public key, or I would
Absolutely.
have to? Okay. And
Yeah.
then part of the issue with, like, let me just say this real quick and then you can
Mhm.
correct or re-say it.
Yeah.
But like then I send that email and maybe the risk or the challenge with PGP is how do I know that that is your public or that that is your public key? Like that could be somebody
Right.
that somehow inserted their public key. So is that about right?
Right. Yeah. So that is a tricky bit there. So for a while there were kind of these, they almost operated as like phone book systems, just listings
Okay.
of public PGP keys. So you could see,
Yeah.
okay, I want to this is especially important for say you're a whistleblower. You really want to send something to a reporter at the New York Times, but if somebody depending on what you're blowing a whistle about,
Yeah.
makes a fake page or a fake listing that, hi, I'm a journalist here, you can contact me, here's my key,
Mm,
verifying that is very tricky. So a lot of people have gone ahead, and you'll see this is pretty standard on a lot of like security researchers or journalists, social media accounts. They will publish their public key as a way for people to say, okay, cool, I have this extra spot where I can really go and check.
okay.
And that's another thing that is kind of a little bit annoying with PGP. This a usability thing. These keys are
Yeah.
very long.
Yeah.
It's not a okay, cool. I'm journalist 123. It's a very very long key.
Yeah.
So going through, and if you're really relying on PGP to protect your security, especially like,
Okay.
but your private key, you should never disclose to anyone.
Yeah.
That's secret. That stays with you.
And my understanding with how because this is math that goes way beyond me, and maybe we don't even dive in too much, but the way that the public private key works is the public key can be known. Heck, you can publish it on your Twitter profile, and
Yep.
that's required.
Mhm.
But when you do that, you're basically creating the lock that
Mhm.
mathematically only your private key can actually unlock. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, basically. It's the I'm not a career-wise, I'm not a mathematician.
Yeah.
That's not the hardcore encryption math that we leave that to the cryptography team here.
Yeah.
But that's basically the gist of it, is that that public key is able to close it, to protect it, and then that private key can decrypt the email. But like knowing the public key, you can't use that key to decrypt it. That doesn't
Yeah.
have that's not possible. So it's this
Okay.
in a way, it's kind of this weird one-way movement. And
Yeah.
that's the same with all asymmetric encryption that's using these public private keys. They all work in a similar fashion.
And that's what, like, is that basically the definition of asymmetric cryptography is this
Mhm.
public private key, right? Is that correct?
For the most part, yeah. So the alternative then being symmetric encryption, which is going to be, okay, cool. I'm encrypting this data with a password. The password is password 1 1 2 3. When
Yeah.
I give it to you, you will also decrypt it using password 1 2 3.
Okay.
That's the symmetry. It's the same. They're identical. The
I
encryption and
see.
decryption keys are identical.
And is that, I mean, is that a little bit then what Tuta and others I've seen use when if I'm sending an email that is encrypted and I have to provide my recipient with the password that would unlock that particular email? Is that correct?
Yeah, and this is the thing that's which is kind of interesting with email, is it's a lot of these encrypted email providers, Tuta included, you're using a mix of both asymmetric and symmetric encryption.
Okay.
And this is due to performance issues. So going through and that initial key exchange to encrypt and decrypt the contents of an email, that is typically sent with asymmetric encryption.
Okay.
But asymmetric encryption is going to go through and encrypt and decrypt large amounts of data is going to be a little bit slower than symmetric encryption.
Okay. That's
So
interesting. So
there's this kind of combination that's used.
I see. Okay. Well, I know that Tuta, I've read a number of the press releases, and it's very interesting to me, has talked about putting together this new post-quantum encryption that you're now using with your email provider.
Right.
Explain to me, one, why is that necessary? You know, especially when we don't right now, there's not really a quantum computer that I
Mhm.
know of that is in working order, like full working order.
Mhm.
You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. And then what exactly are we doing? Like, what is this protecting from?
Right. Yeah. So I guess to kind of start with what the threat would be, because like you're
Sure.
saying, yes, at present that we know of, we don't know what's happening on some
Other
secret
country.
government projects
Yeah.
or something. Um, Basically, at this moment, there isn't a quantum computer that is strong enough to attack the current classic encryption protocols that we're using, like AES, RSA, elliptic curve cryptography. This is all stuff that is currently safe, it's currently used,
Okay.
but there is the cryptological threat here is that in the event that a quantum computer has the resources to go ahead and run what is called Shor's algorithm, it will be able to go ahead and, again, this is math.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Keep going.
So it will go ahead and it can break, if a quantum computer is powerful enough to run this algorithm, it will be able to break the majority of our public key cryptography. So in
Okay.
this case, PGP as it exists now isn't quantum safe.
Okay.
Quantum safe meaning that this is an example of like quantum safe encryption. So the current version of Tuta, so TutalCrypt is the name of the protocol.
Okay.
It's simply encryption that doesn't rely on the hardness of factoring these large integers or other cryptographic problems that could be solved by a quantum computer. So as long as a encryption protocol is able to move, doesn't depend on, okay, that's a really big number that the computer can't break it down. As long as it doesn't depend on that, it's included in as being one of these post-quantum encryption protocols.
Okay.
But the mathematical problems behind this are that's its own beast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
You got a big semi trying to back up near you or something?
Yeah, I think it's somebody out in the parking lot. I'm sorry.
No, that's
Um,
okay.
but what is kind of interesting with this is the current threat from this future of with quantum computers, that it specifically poses a threat towards asymmetric encryption. But
Okay.
symmetric encryption systems, which like the big one that everyone would know would be AES, so
Okay.
Advanced Encryption Standard. If you're using AES 256, that is quantum resistant for data stored at rest.
Okay.
So if you have we are using this, I believe most platforms are securing data at rest with at least AES 256. As long as that isn't leaving the server, when it's just sitting there waiting, it is protected against quantum computer.
Interesting. So does
Mhm.
that mean like that would include something like Gmail or Yahoo too, right? When it comes to what they do for at-rest data?
That's the question. I'm not super familiar. I would need to look it up what
Yeah.
exactly they're using. But if at rest, if they are using AES-256 to secure data, then it is the cryptography is secure. It's a question of who has access to the keys. And that is a thing that these privacy protecting providers are really pushing. For example, Tuta doesn't have any access to user encryption keys. That is device dependent. That's one reason why with these, that's kind of I wouldn't say a drawback, it's a feature. With encrypted services, you can't reset your password. You can't contact support to reset a password. That is a security move. The idea being, okay, if a service doesn't have those keys, they can't be forced to turn them over.
And like, I'm sure Tuta is like pretty much every other security company or tech company that I know of. I mean, you guys have to deal with those kind of requests, don't you?
We do. You get yes. And one thing for us, and this is a nice thing about being located in Germany, we are protected by GDPR and other EU privacy laws. So any of these requests that might come in, they have to first be fully verified by a German court. So if the FBI were to send a information request about a Tuta user, we are legally not allowed to reply to that. So there is this legal protection there. We are only legally required to respond to a German court order. Of course, this is a case where, and this is something you've seen in the news in the privacy space, that of course these like in law enforcement cases, they work together. Interpol exists, Europol exists. So there is a certain degree of where they will work together. And again, that is where going ahead and I'm not condoning using encrypted email accounts for criminal activity. But say if you're a whistleblower, for example, someone might be very interested in learning about you, and having that kind of peace of mind that none of your encrypted data can be turned over is important.
And you had talked about the difference between, I was going to say the difference between encrypted data and metadata. What if any information is visible? And maybe this is a service dependent question. So maybe it's different for Tuta, which is different for others. But like, is IP, the IP address, is that visible? Are there like what parts of the email are actually visible outside of encryption?
Right. Yeah. So two questions. I think I kind of missed one of your earlier ones. You asked about you had asked about the threat for what is the threat posed by like quantum computers for our current data, right? I think that was in there. And the big threat with that is it's a practice called harvest now, decrypt later. We'll see this kind of sprinkled throughout privacy forums. People will say this, and basically what that means is, quantum computers don't exist yet, to our knowledge, to the degree that they could really pose a threat to encryption algorithms. But it's assumed that, this will be possible, and that this is APTs, advanced persistent threat, nation state actor, they have the resources to develop something like that. So rather than just let all of this encrypted data right now float around and we'll get to it later, they're collecting it. And so we've seen this with starting with Snowden leaks. There are huge disclosures about this, where there are just global data collections. All sorts of different countries around the world are collecting this encrypted data, storing it. Right now, they can't necessarily read it, but the idea being, we have this encrypted data here on our servers. At whatever point we are able to turn the powerful enough quantum computer on, they can decrypt all of that. And that is that's why it's important that whenever possible, if you're really concerned about your privacy, that you use post-quantum encryption as much as you can.
So the question about metadata and email, like what is visible and what's not.
Right. So with standard email, things that are going to be visible, even if you go ahead, and this is even the case with PGP, if you encrypt the content, so like that email body, email addresses are visible, who is sending the email address, who the recipient address is. Timestamps are available on mail by a
Really?
specific mail server. So I can see that, yeah, Josh sent me an email at this time, and it was received at on my server maybe at this time. This kind of stuff is visible. IP addresses from sending mail servers are visible, sending and receiving mail servers. Otherwise, the email wouldn't know exactly where it needs to go.
Okay.
And another thing, which is kind of spooky when you if you don't already know it, is that subject lines are typically not encrypted. So a lot of the time, those will be visible metadata.
I mean, to me, it makes sense that you need to know the, where it's going and maybe even where it's starting from, like that information. That makes sense to me. The subject line, though, that's a little bit of a surprise to me. Why is that?
Yeah. Why exactly that needs to be or needs to be public data? I don't actually think it needs to be. And this is something that's really cool with Tuta is we encrypt that. That's not open. So when sending encrypted emails through Tuta, that subject line is also secured. So of course, operational data will be visible because otherwise you're going to need to print the email and hand deliver it to them.
Yeah.
But yeah, with Tuta, we have taken steps to move forward and actually keep that blocked out too. Especially if you're going to go ahead and say you're sending, you could be sending like calendar invite, and usually there can be sensitive information in there, and so it's important that that is also protected. Otherwise, if you're scheduling, hey, we're going to have I need to meet a journalist. It's probably best that you don't say we're going to be here at this time at this date. So it's important that also be encrypted.
Okay.
Which
that being like the attachment of the calendar invite, or what exactly are you?
If you included that in the subject line specifically.
Gotcha. Yeah.
If you're going ahead and sending like encrypted emails, any attachments aren't included as metadata.
Yeah.
That would be that's all encrypted.
That's all encrypted as well. Okay. Interesting.
And one thing you can see that this kind of encryption works, it does pose an annoyance maybe to people who are interested in snooping on this information, because there are also there has been malware, spyware malware, that's been developed specifically to kind of try to get around this with, okay, breaking this encryption isn't going to work. But once you open that email, say you have your encrypted email app on your phone, you open it up, that email is decrypted. And one of the big pieces of spyware that has been in the news that specifically does this is Pegasus, the Pegasus spyware from the NSO group.
Yeah.
And it's kind of that, okay, if the math can't be broken, find another way. So that is also something to keep in mind. Fortunately, that spyware is apparently extremely expensive. So you need to be very interesting for someone to throw it at you. But exactly, this did happen to Jamal Khashoggi, and other journalists have had Pegasus installed on their devices. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And in those cases, again, we're talking about state level actors that have a lot of resources to be pouring into this one person.
This is it. That's not something, if your main privacy concern is going to be, all right, I don't want Google to know everything.
Yeah.
And you can bracket that. That's not necessarily a major concern.
I want to kind of close out our time together in asking you like best practices for using any kind of email. Be that, I mean, hopefully people that are watching this are more predisposed to using something like Tuta. But even if I'm using Gmail, for example, like the sponsor of this live stream being Yubikey, I always recommend, whether you're using a Gmail account or whether you're using Tuta, that you lock that account using a 2FA key. And if I remember right, you show me, like, even you guys, you have a 2FA key, right? A Yubikey? There it is.
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
That's awesome. So yeah, I mean, beyond using a 2FA key to lock your email account like that, are there any other steps that we can or should take to be making sure that we're as secure and private as possible using email?
Right. So yeah, what you're talking about there, super important that it doesn't matter if it's your email account, any account, wherever possible, enable 2FA.
Yeah,
Best choice there if you have U2F, so like these FIDO security keys, that's
yeah,
going to be your best choice. If that's not an option, use an authenticator app. SMS isn't great.
yeah,
It's not secure.
yeah,
Uh, but it's funny enough, it's still by a lot of places is the only option. It's better than nothing, but it's not perfect.
yeah,
Other things to keep in mind as far as best practices go with email. Email is your email address is really it's the hub of your digital life. So if you want to create social media accounts, if you want to go shopping on Amazon or whatever, or another platform that's not Amazon, I don't know, it's personal preferences,
yeah,
then you have to protect that. Like that needs to be kind of protected at all costs. One important step is, in addition to using 2FA, that you take advantage of a password manager. There are tons of password managers out there.
hmm,
There are great open source password managers you can use. You can get password managers that will sync between devices. But what is important is ideally they're open source. So you can go ahead and review that code using unique passwords. You have to use a strong and unique password on every service. So you can't use password123 for email, use it again on your Facebook and again for your bank, because when data breaches happen, that's not an if, it's a when. Um, when that data comes out, if you have passwords that match across different services, these are going to be used in credential stuffing attacks.
yeah,
One other way that you can go ahead and kind of protect yourself on that front with, of course, using unique passwords, you can also go ahead and use unique email addresses. So if you're
yep,
using, and maybe you have a custom domain for your email, then you can go ahead, you can set up a catch-all. So you can just start making an infinite number of burner addresses.
yeah,
This is actually something we've just introduced in Tuta with the new, as part of our kind of restructuring for subscription plans. If
okay,
you're using a custom domain, you can create an unlimited amount of email aliases.
okay,
And by using a unique alias and a unique password, you are better protecting that core account, because, okay, that core address isn't going to be displayed if, maybe you wanted to sign up for some stupid giveaway at the grocery
yeah,
store and they want an
yeah,
email address. Just use a burner. You don't
yeah,
need to overexpose that information. So yeah, as far as email goes, that would operational security tips that would apply from Gmail to encrypted
yeah,
providers, 2FA, password manager, unique passwords, and using email aliases is a great step. Of course, then you can also jump and start using VPNs. You can go ahead and connect through the Tor network if you
yeah,
believe that is necessary for your threat model. Um, the sky is the limit,
yeah,
but that core,
yeah,
protecting your login is really crucial.
yeah. Yeah, I did a video a few weeks ago that I published that was basically just reviewing the secure email options that are out there, and Tuta
Yeah,
was
yeah.
one of two that were my top recommendations.
Mhm.
And I want to give you just an opportunity, first of all, to say thank you for the time that you've offered here to us,
Mhm.
but also just to say, hey, what's the why is it that you work at Tuta, and what do you think of, like, why would you tell somebody you should, like, what are the reasons or the features that you would say this is why I think you should use Tuta?
Okay. Ooh, shameless plug.
Shameless
Yeah.
plug. I'm giving you the opportunity, man.
Ooh, okay. Yeah, cool. Why I work at Tuta? I was a customer before I started working here. I had
Okay.
used Tuta for a few years before I actually started working here, and I think what for me what is important about Tuta and with these kind of like dedicated encrypted email providers in general is like Tuta makes encryption easy. We talked a little bit about going through and managing your PGP keys. Um,
Yeah.
I would never expect my grandma to learn how to use PGP. It's just not, I don't think it's a feasible expectation
Yeah.
for a fair amount of the public. I don't want to say people aren't smart enough. I think everyone is smart enough to do it. Um, it is annoying. it's not the easiest way to do it. And I think for me, what is important and something that I'm excited about with working at Tuta is having that ability to go ahead and make encryption easy to use for the masses. So instead of having to go ahead and insert keys and make sure, authenticate that they're protected, you only need to push a single button. It's one-click encryption. And that's something that everyone can use. I also think one thing that's great with Tuta is Tuta has been around. Last week, for example, Tuta turned 10. The company is now 10 years old, which is pretty cool. And I think that's really great to see, because something specific, or kind of not necessarily, maybe a little bit difficult or a challenge for working in the privacy space, is you have to build a very unique kind of trust with customers, because they're expecting you to protect your data. And we saw this happen with the rise and sale of Skiff. Like, that was a great platform. Awesome to see that there are more options within the privacy space. That's always good. Everyone can benefit from that. But then seeing that drop out kind of out of the blue is startling. So at Tuta, we've already have this established position. We've been around the block a time or two. And what's also important to me is that at the end of the day, Tuta isn't about only pushing a product. It's about pushing this message of privacy. And that's something that all of the employees here are fully committed to. It's not just 9-to-5 software development. The team here is made up of really committed privacy activists who are we're just trying to go ahead and make a private, ethical alternative to big tech. And so far it seems to be working. So yeah.
Well, congratulations on 10 years. And again, Brandon, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time and providing us with some really helpful insights into email encryption and how all of that works.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Maybe next time, if we want to have another talk, you can come and visit us in Hanover.
Hey, yeah, that would be awesome. I'd love to do that. All right. Well, that is the interview with Brandon from Tuta. Hopefully next time I am sitting in Germany doing that interview, because I'd love to visit their offices at some point. Well, listen, it's been really good to interact with a lot of you in the comments so far. There's been some really good questions, and I want to spend a few minutes before we finish up this live stream answering a couple of those. If you have any others, feel free to leave them in the comments, but I've starred a few that I want to address right here. The first is this. George says, do any of these secure email providers support self-destructing emails? And yes, both Proton and Tuta support self-destructing. As a matter of fact, I even think you can do this with Gmail through their confidential mode. You can do a self-destructing email, but it only really works if you're sending to another Gmail user. For Proton and Tuta, because you're using end-to-end encryption and the email remains on their servers, so it's never the full email contents are never actually hitting the email server of the person that you're sending to, then you maintain control and you can say when that email is no longer accessible. You can change the password, I believe. Don't quote me on that one, but I do know that you can do self-destructing emails. So George, great question there. You can set up the password and then you can set up how long that email is accessible for. A1 says, if I have Tuta and send email to my bank, do I need to give the bank a password? This is an interesting question. And I know a lot of people, they want to do encrypted email because of emails going back and forth with their bank. And the problem is that unless you're dealing with an individual personal banker, so you're not dealing with like the bank support, using encrypted emails that require a password to unlock it is just, it's not possible. It doesn't work. And so for that reason, using encrypted email in this way with a bank just it doesn't work out, or at least I've never figured out a great way to do it. So, my lawyer, my CPA, those are the people, the individuals or the organizations that I will use these password encrypted emails with. But otherwise, I wouldn't necessarily be able to use it with a bank. Great question though. All right, Jason Moore says, how does the other person get the shared password, and does every secure email have a different password? Are they OTPs or one-time passwords? Three really great questions, Jason, and I know I answered them in the chat for you while we were going along, but I also want to respond here because I think it was a really good question. First of all, you set the passwords on a per email basis. So it's not a blanket password that then gets used for every email that you send out. You have to create a password for every single one of those. And the ways that you get that password to the recipient of your email really depends upon you. I would suggest not using the same medium to send the password that you would send the email. So don't email them the password. Perhaps you can text them, or you can use some other secure, use Signal and use Signal to send that over. Or, hopefully if you have some kind of face-to-face conversation, you can say, hey, any emails are going to use this password. This is the shared password that you and I are always going to use when we're emailing back and forth. Those are great ways to make sure that you're getting that password to somebody. My primary suggestion in this case is that you make sure you're not using the same medium to send that secure password, especially if the whole purpose of this is to maintain some level of privacy and security. And then finally, OTPs, it's not the same. So an OTP is like that 6-digit number that gets sent to you whenever you're trying to log into your bank or some other account. This is different because it is a password you are setting and you can set yourself. So that's the difference between all of those. All right, we're going to continue on with some other questions. If you've got any more, please put them in the chat. I'm still looking at this live as we go along. Let's see here. George says, what's the best way to send passwords? Oh, I already answered that one. Sorry. I'm going to go continue on. He had another great question here. Currently, I'm using Yubikey and only key, but if passkeys are becoming more common and secure, do I still need a Yubikey? This is an excellent question just because this is a question that I had myself, right? We're moving from passwords to a password plus a key to what feels like a shift over to only passkeys. And here's my thought on that. Passkeys are an excellent friction or an excellent way to add the security of a 2FA key with less friction. So instead of, for my mom, for example, instead of having to explain to her how to use a Yubikey or for somebody that maybe doesn't have the financial means to purchase a Yubikey for some reason, it's just not in their budget. A passkey is going to be much better than just using a password, but there is still a reliance on two things. One, software, and then two, whatever service you're using to hold that passkey. So that could be a password manager. Password managers like 1Password and Bitwarden and Dashlane, they hold passkeys if you want them to. You can also keep your passkey on your phone. So Apple will hold passkeys, as will Android. The problem that I have with that personally is that now, again, I'm trusting Apple or I'm trusting 1Password with these keys. So you're adding in another third party that we're having to trust with this. And the second thing is passkeys, because their software, are replicatable. I think that's the word, right? Not replicable. Maybe it's replicable. They're replicable, which means that you can copy passkeys very easily. As a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons why somebody might put a passkey in 1Password, is so that it can be replicated both on their desktop and their mobile device and all the different devices that they use. Keeping a passkey on a 2FA key like Yubikey, which can be done. You can store your passkeys on a 2FA key. What that means is this right here, I'm going to pull these up again. These right here cannot be copied, right? They're specifically designed. Now, I know there are other keys that can be copied. I think only key might, if I remember right, you can go in and copy that. I actually don't like that. I think it's a security feature of Yubikey that it cannot be copied. And so keeping that on there, a passkey on here, means that you have complete control of it. And there's something about a physical storage device as opposed to storing it in the cloud with let's say 1Password, or keeping it on your device with Apple, where if you lose your device, with your Apple phone, that could be a problem. I mean, I guess the same thing also applies for a Yubikey as well. But that's why, if you haven't heard me say this today, I'll say it now. That is the reason why it's so important to have both a primary and a backup, no matter what you're using. whether it is a 2FA key, whether it's an authenticator app, if that's what you use, or if you're using passkeys, you always want to make sure that you have that backup, because something can and more than likely will happen that will make the primary way that you store that security, that two-factor authentication, unusable. And so you need to have something that's going to allow you to have a backup, and so you don't get locked out, because the whole point of doing this kind of security is owning your own keys. Right? Making sure that you're not reliant on another service like Google or Apple to hold all these keys for you. So in that case, I want to make sure that if I'm holding my own keys, I'm doing so responsibly. And responsibly means having both a primary and a backup. In a lot of cases, I keep, whatever the seed phrase is that they have, and doing that. So I learned so much from talking with Brandon at Tuta. And like I said before, both Tuta and Proton, either of those are excellent options. There's actually other great ones, MailFence, StartMail. I particularly was impressed and liked the way that Tuta and ProtonMail work, and in part because those were the two that allowed for 2FA security. So you can lock your Tuta account with a 2FA key from Yubikey. You can lock your Proton account with a 2FA key from Yubikey. And both of those, it maintains the privacy of your account, as well as all the encryption that happens when you're emailing and sending messages out from Tuta or Proton out into the rest of the world. PGP was really interesting. I did want to say something that it didn't make sense to me as much before I had this conversation with Brandon, but I had talked with Proton at one point, because remember, during the conversation with Brandon, we found out that Tuta does not rely on PGP encryption, whereas Proton does. And one of the downfalls of PGP encryption is that public-private key set, trying to know for sure that the public key that you are sending to is the one to the person that you want to actually send to. So nobody could fake it and make you think that, oh, this is their public key, when it actually isn't. And that is where Proton actually introduced something earlier this year, I think it was, where they're using blockchain to make sure that all of the keys, the public PGP keys, are the correct keys for the person that you want to send to. And it's an interesting way to utilize the benefits of blockchain, which is that it is immutable. It can't be changed, because blockchain is something that is it's proven across multiple computers or servers that are holding all of this information. And so if a journalist or somebody else wants to put their PGP key into this blockchain directory, they can know for sure that it can't easily be changed. And then somebody that's sending an email can double check, okay, this person says this is their PGP key. I am going to check that on the blockchain PGP directory. And if that's the case, great, now I can send this email. So it adds a little bit of trust in there that maybe is missing whenever you're using this whole PGP encryption, which, by the way, as I was talking with Brandon, I didn't realize that we're talking about an encryption that hasn't changed much and was created like 20 some odd years ago. It's crazy to me. But anyway, that was something that I found interesting. And it's one of the ways that Proton has kind of mitigated that risk of using this public-private key PGP encryption. And yeah, I had somebody ask earlier and I didn't have it starred, so I can't really look at it right now. But when it comes to, like, somebody asked, is asymmetric encryption, that public-private key, is it kind of like your routing for bank and your bank account number? And I would say that it's different, mostly because in the case of your banking, you sometimes have to provide your routing number and your bank account number in order to receive any type of money into your bank account. When it comes to encryption, you never, ever, ever give out your private key. Like your public key, yes, that can go out, that can be known. It doesn't matter who it is, it doesn't matter if it's your family or what, you never give out your private key. And that's the difference here between some of these other things. So let's see, you can create 2 passkeys. Daniel, that's a great question. I'll answer this real quick. He was asking, I was talking about doing a backup. Yes, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. What you can do is, if you have a passkey as one of your primary ways of backing up, or as your primary way of securing an account, your backup can also be needs to be something that you have access to. So if the service doesn't let you create a second passkey, which some might not, then what you would have to do is then make sure that you've got a key set up as your backup or something along those lines. You have one via iPhone Face ID for a couple things. Yeah, that's great. Essentially, again, what you're doing here is you're relying on Apple to hold your passkey. And so your passkey, instead of being a Yubikey, is your phone, the actual device. And that is something that can be, then I'm pretty sure, I'm gonna have to do a little bit more research on this. I'm pretty sure that means that it gets copied across all of your different Apple ID devices. But don't quote me on that because I'm not 100% sure. We are past the hour mark. There are probably 500 other things that we could talk about here because email encryption and just encryption in general is just so fascinating to me. It is a math that I never really got into. And so I don't even now still fully comprehend all of it. But I did want to say thank you guys so much for joining me on this. Thank you to Yubikey and Yubiko for sponsoring this live stream and a lot of our live streams this year. If you don't have a key yet and you want to get $5 off, go to allthingssecure.com/Yubikey5off and you can get that. I recommend the 5 series, which can be used both as a key, like for FIDO2, as well as an authenticator app. So it can actually store authenticator codes on the key itself. I've got a whole video describing how you can do that. But if you want to save a little bit of money, they have their security key series, which is usually, I think, $25, maybe $30. I think it's $25, and you can get $5 off. And I think the code applies to 2 keys. So you could get $10 off total if you wanted to using this code. So thank you guys again so much for, Dark says, can I do another passkey explanation video? I sure hope so. That's something that's on my radar and it's something I want to do. It's something I got to do a lot of research on personally first. But again, thank you all so much for taking time with me. And I look forward to seeing you in our next live stream. I've got a video coming up. By the way, I've got a video coming out this Thursday that is going to be talking about cameras and all the different EXIF data that gets stored on a lot of the pictures we take. It's been a lot of fun to put that together, and I look forward to sharing that with you. So I hope you guys have a great rest of your night or day, depending on where you are in the world, and I will talk with you later.